Hello there. Societies change throughout time. Sometimes this change can be painful, sometimes it's quick, sometimes it's slow. But if you go to the early days of any civilization, group, or organization and compare it to what it's like 100 years later, 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, you'll see stark differences. In some cases, in fact, most cases, throughout human history, civilizations that existed 5,000 years ago don't exist anymore. That is not the case for every civilization, China for example, but they do certainly evolve and they do change how they approach life, their political views, all kinds of stuff. And the same can be said for the Federation, and specifically Starfleet. Starfleet, of course, is not a civilization, it is an entity, an organization within a greater civilization, but it is very reflective of those societal changes and how the Federation as a whole exists. And that's what we're going to be discussing today, how Starfleet has evolved and how it somewhat reflects the Federation of each generation of where Starfleet exists. So, without further ado, let's start at the beginning. The earliest days of Starfleet, of course, is in the early 22nd century. It is an entirely human civilization, although there were joint missions between them and the Vulcans, notably the one aboard the NX-01, but there were other attempts for Vulcan crew members to serve aboard Starfleet ships around this time. Starfleet, of course, had spun off from several earlier institutions that had coalesced into a single agency known as Starfleet. Starfleet would be politically active at this time period, but it wasn't really a political force within the United Earth in and of itself. Again, this was more like an agency like the Navy or the Air Force or NASA, or a bit of all of them really. At this time, Starfleet was predominantly involved in scientific research and exploration. There was a separate military, the MACOs, that handled defense. That wasn't to say that Starfleet, however, didn't have military aspects even at this time. Because let's face reality, if Starfleet really wanted to be a peaceful organization and not worry about war or violence, they wouldn't put weapons on their ships at all. If they really thought you could confront the universe with good intentions and good things that happen to you back, you wouldn't put a single phaser aboard your ship, but they do. So there are suggestions of it, even at this time period. In fact, the Starfleet at this time period, not only do they have the hot-headed spirit of adventure that's come from humanity over the last couple of hundred years, but they're actually borderline almost aggressive in how they want to get out there, not to seize technology but to learn, to explore. These are actually positive attributes, but humanity does have a reputation, and a well-earned one at this time, for sticking its nose in, and that is mostly via Starfleet. Humans have been sending ships out into deep space for years without really sticking their noses in. It wasn't until the launch of the NX-01 that humans really got out into deep space and began running into races like the Andorians, the Klingons and others, and got involved in various different types of interstellar politics that dragged humanity out from being a provincial race into an actual sector-wide, or at least local provincial power, and force to be reckoned with both economically, politically and militarily. With the Enterprise, despite its inferior technology to many of the more established powers, demonstrated that it was more than capable of holding its own. Around this time, of course, Starfleet built its ships in a non-military concept, with famously the NX-01 only being launched with 3 phasers and a few plasma weapons and spatial missiles. And by launched with, that's what it was supposed to have, but didn't when it launched. It actually launched without most of that. Its only defense was polarized hull plating, and Archer, as well as a number of others, were big voices arguing against upgunning the ship. Starfleet didn't want to be perceived as a military organization. They didn't think it was a good first impression. This would be throughout Starfleet history, so I'm not going to keep mentioning that. Starfleet will always want to present itself as a peaceful organization, and therefore, particularly vessels that are going first contact missions and vessels of exploration, these are not military ships. Although they are defended and have weapons and the ability to fight off most threats, they are not warships. So they actually give that image, because Starfleet strongly believes, and I am personally a proponent of and agree with them completely, that if you rock up on someone's doorstep in a heavily armed battlecruiser like a Romulan warbird, it sends a different message than turning up in a Galaxy-class starship, for example. So at this time, Starfleet establishes that train of thought. Its deep space missions are going to be ones of exploration and peace, but they're not going to leave the ships without claws, so they can, defend themselves, at least on some level, against the threats that they anticipate these ships may run into, even if it's only enough to wound the enemy while they run away. Starfleet would always build their ships to be fast as a consequence of this. It wasn't just to get there quick, it was to get away from it as well. This continued even throughout the Earth-Romulan War. Starfleet would devolve back into a more military footing around this time, working more with the military, building ships that were cheaper and more mass-producible, but generally speaking, aside from this blip in the 22nd century, Starfleet was predominantly filled with the spirit of adventure. Most of the ships they would build would be pure exploratory vessels. We do have ships like the Intrepid type, which were more militarily focused. They were a bit more of a patrol vessel, but there was no out-and-out warships. There was the Makos to that. The Makos, though, would fold into Starfleet, which is very notable, after the Earth-Romulan War. Choosing this more military side to be integrated with Starfleet is an interesting decision for an agency that claims to be peaceful. Now, we do know that Starfleet will create the Starfleet Marines, and although this would never be a big agency, it likely didn't exist before the Makos folded into Starfleet. That's likely what the Makos of state soldiers remained. As a result, Starfleet around this time period was a bit more militarized, it was a bit more juiced up, but it was still generally with a strong spirit of adventure. But everything was new. Races that would be deeply familiar to us now, like Vulcans and Dorians, they were less familiar to Earth at this time period. Certainly races like the Romulans, the Cardassians, and others were less well known. And humans were still meeting these races and still getting to know them, and having to put on a strong face, particularly considering they didn't have many deep space colonies or outposts. They wouldn't really have for another 100 years. And as a result, the Starfleet vessels that existed around this time period had to be very self-sufficient and able to look after themselves without needing extensive resupply and without needing to be recovered or repaired by forces going out to them. Meaning the Starfleet ships around this time were very robust and very capable. Yes, they were fast, but they weren't that fast. But they got out into deep space and there was no help. And the crews aboard these ships had that again, spirit of adventure, that almost pirate-like gung-ho attitude, where, as it was quoted by people in the 24th century, although they were talking about people in the 23rd, they were a little bit quicker to reach for their phasers when their back was against the wall. And it was a different time. And the crews back then had to make sure that their ships survived, and the captain was responsible for everyone. So sometimes defaulting to a more aggressive tactical standpoint was necessary. Plus, many of the preceding Starfleet officers that came before them had learned the hard way in the Romulan War, and then with the Makos being funneled in, many of the training and organizational Starfleet was influenced by, it can't possibly not have been, by the folding in of Starfleet. Into Starfleet, of the Makos. So, how did that affect Starfleet of the 23rd century that we begin to see? As I said, just like those of the 22nd, they were much more reliant on their phasers to get the job done sometimes. Their attitude towards Klingons and others was one usually of a little bit more of a hard stance and belligerence. You run into a problem, they were likely to fight it. They were just as likely to punch an alien as they were to kiss it, Kirk. The ships around this time period also reflected this mindset. Just like the ones in the 22nd century, the ships were still built primarily as vessels of exploration. Now, we can't do a full evaluation of Starfleet, because although we do hear statements like about the Defiant class being the first warship, it's really relatively unbelievable. Starfleet always found ways to not classify its ships as warships, just like they did with the Defiant, classifying it as an escort. Meaning, Starfleet probably did have warships, they just didn't like to call them warships. So although we can infer that there was a massive logistical chain and a huge amount of auxiliary ships and support vessels around the 22nd and 23rd, and particularly in the 23rd century, we don't see much of them. But based on what we see of the premier vessels like the Constitution class, these ships are described by other races as more of a cruiser. They're almost considered a battleship. They're big vessels, they're heavily armed. Certainly you can tell on an aesthetic level they're not really built for war. But they're sturdy, they're robust, they're reliable, they're self-sufficient, and they have a lot of basal technology aboard them that's designed to be low maintenance. It's why, allegedly, the ships look a little more primitive than the technology was capable of producing at the time than what they could potentially be, because they wanted them to be simple, user-friendly, and easy to repair. So these ships were powerful, but they were still scientific. In fact, it's good to say, as much as we see aboard ships under Captain Christopher Pike, we see that the crew had options for heavier ordnance. They kept them locked away, with only high-level officers able to access them. Body armor was available. As I've discussed in previous episodes, Starfleet had body armor, it just chose not to use it because, again, this is how they wanted to be perceived. Also, security personnel are not soldiers. Starfleet has soldiers, it has the Marines. Starfleet personnel getting given body armor was done out of necessity during times of war or crisis. But as ship security were literally that, ship security. They were not soldiers designed for boarding missions, playing pirates and playing soldier on a planet holding a city against its will. That's not what they were for. They were there to guard the crew and maintain order aboard ship and run investigations. They were a security guard service with phasers. So they were not soldiers. But Starfleet knew that such things were necessary, and as a result it still endorsed this sort of more sometimes belligerent attitude towards newly encountered races. It's like, we want to be your friends, so we're sending this big ship. Yes, it's powerful, but that's just to show that we are strong. We're not here to fight you. You don't want us here, we'll leave. But don't try and fight us, because we'll break your nose. Hell, we'll break your planet. And that was the 23rd century version of Starfleet. They were still securing their borders. They still had a lot of problems with the Romulans, the Klingons, the Gorn, and others. Keeping and maintaining those borders was essential for the security and safety of the Federation. And as a result, people were enamored and enthralled by all the new discoveries being made, but also at all the new threats and all the new dangers. And as a result, although this was kind of sexy and kind of alluring to many, it was still very dangerous, and Starfleet had to treat it as such. And their methods of exploration and the way they conducted themselves, the fact that individuals like Kirk, who was effectively just an astronaut, he was just an explorer, was so famous, so legendary across the Federation, more than just within Starfleet, shows Starfleet had become less of a provincial Earth agency, and now it was a premier Federation agency. And it represented the attitudes of the Federation at the time. We're not soft, we're not weak, we're strong, but we are still on a mission of peace. The Federation wants harmony. Other races, such as the Romulans, would note, although we're skipping ahead of ourselves here, but we're moving into this era next anyway, that they knew that Starfleet was not weak or naive or stupid, as some members of their government, the Romulans we're talking about specifically here, would have them try and have the military believe. Starfleet was a much stronger agency than they gave it credit for. Starfleet wanted to produce this image of being peaceful, but in reality it was the carrot and the stick. They did still have a stick. But let's skip again a little bit. Let's go past the Khitomer Accords. Late 23rd century, now we see Starfleet starting to ease into a more peaceful era. The Romulans have gone into a sort of period of isolation. The Klingons have been somewhat pacified, if you can ever truly pacify a Klingon, and the Federation is entering into the early stages of what we would know as the Golden Age of exploration. The ships being built here are going to be in service for decades, unusually long even for Starfleet vessels of this level of technology. You would have ships built here and now, in the late 23rd century, in the 2270s, 80s and 90s, still in use in the 2370s, 80s and 90s, 100 years later, and probably beyond. And although we would see around that time period those classes of ships being retired and replaced by more advanced models, mostly we start to see that happen from the 2360s after the encounter of the Borg. But that's the Golden Age, the beginning of it. Still we see a tinkering of a hint of this sort of more belligerent side. The Ambassador class ship is still more of a cruiser, built along the lines of the Constitution class concept than the Galaxy class. But as we enter into the 24th century and we reach the era of Picard, we start to see that Starfleet has been complacent, sitting on its laurels a little bit. And yes, the ships are still very powerful. Starfleet's still strong. They're able to handle the Cardassians and others of these, but they've got complacent with themselves. They think they can handle anything. Q points it out that humanity really has no idea what's out there. And Starfleet may have evolved, it may have changed, but not necessarily for the better. They've lost their edge. They've lost that sharp point they had when Kirk was exploring space. They almost say it in a derogatory, almost comical term that people of Kirk's age were much more likely to reach for their phaser than a negotiating tablet. But maybe there was a reason. Starfleet still builds big ships that are very powerful but are predominantly built for peace, and that's good. That's what they should do. That is the image you want to portray. But around this time they've stopped building ships like the Miranda. The Miranda class was not a warship, not a true warship, but it was certainly, for a vessel which was more compact than a Constitution class, it had a bigger internal volume, It was better armed and was a more compact, sturdier, more tactical design. Even though it was not a warship, you could call it an escort, certainly. It was a highly versatile ship platform, but realistically Starfleet wasn't, as far as we can tell. They certainly were building things like it, but they weren't evolving it. They weren't continuing it. We see by the Battle of Wolf 359 what the best stuff Starfleet had to offer was not going to be stuff like the Defiant. It was that battle that made them see the weakness in their own fleet, their complacency. Yet their ships were strong and good at dealing with some of the local threats, but not the new things they were encountering. In the 23rd century, Starfleet had built ships to anticipate things being much worse than what they were used to. So they built the ships with strong hulls, strong shields, heavy armaments, not because they wanted to build a warship, but because they wanted those new threats to realize that humanity and the Federation and Starfleet was not weak, not a pushover. And by the 24th century, that had been lost a little bit in translation through complacency. That's not to say that the ships were not still strong, but they were holding on to too many relics, too many old ideas, and not enough new. We see over the next few decades, of course, a massive revolution, particularly pushed on by the Borg and the Dominion War, but ships like the Sabre class, the Defiant class, the Sovereign class, the Prometheus class, the Defiant class, the Norway class to a slightly lesser degree, as well as the Akira class and others, all built and commissioned by the 2370s, which are more of a battle-hardened core. There's likely an expansion of the Starfleet Marines, who have already been quite low in number due to the Dominion War. We see more aggressively trained officers, such as Red Squad, also being churned out. Starfleet, I'm not going to say it woke up, because I think absolutely saying Starfleet had no teeth at this time is wrong, and I'm not going to say that they were entirely naive, but I think the dominant voices within the Federation, and as a result influencing Starfleet, were ones who were constantly like, we'll sacrifice a ship when we encounter a new hostile race if it means we keep peace with that race. If they blow up one of our ships, we won't seek retribution, we won't go to war with them, whereas in Kirk's time that's probably exactly what they would have done. Now they'll appease them and they'll only go to war if they absolutely have to, and they'll try and insidiously grind them down, trying to use negotiation. It wasn't until encountering a race like the Borg, who none of that matters, that they really started to think like their predecessors had done 100 years later. And although this was not without its problems, and would likely have influenced how they explore space, Starfleet certainly became a more of an aggressive military force to be reckoned with, for better or for worse, which you can discuss in the comments if you think it was for the better or for the worse. With a more militaristic core, but still putting on the happy face as they should, with ships like the Neo-Constitution class starships doing a lot of the exploration. Not a warship, not a combat vessel, but a ship of exploration and peace, as it should be, but backed up by the stick once again. And then let's skip over. We don't know much about what Starfleet and the Federation was like in the following centuries immediately after this. We only really get glimpses and snippets, such as the Enterprise J, references by certain time agents. It's not until, we can't even really include the 29th century here, it's not until the 32nd century that we really start to see what's going on. Earth has now left the Federation, and we have the United Earth Defense Force, which has kind of replaced the Earth Starfleet. And Starfleet as an agency has become an entirely freelance agency by this point in some way, and is now purely part of the Federation. Earth, although many humans are still part of the Federation, Earth is no longer. But Starfleet seems to still predominantly be human despite that around this time period, which is interesting. Starfleet has taken a much more of a war footing by this time period. The events in the wider galaxy with hostile powers, despite the dissolution of the Romulans and realistically the decreased threat of the Klingons and others, there are still threats. The Orions are still a problem and various others. So, yeah, the Federation's still got its problems. So as a result, Starfleet has become less a vessel of an organization of exploration and has become much more militaristic. Almost belligerent. It's now pretty much almost lost the carrot entirely and has become purely the stick. And it's not until the return of Discovery and the rediscovery of more dilithium, the pacification through negotiation of the Federation's enemies, rather than the constant war footing against them, which really was one of the Federation Starfleet's strengths. As much as we may look down and like laugh at, like, oh, they build stupid little ships like the Oberth that can't defend itself. Those ships are absolutely necessary. See my episode on my case for the Oberth class as to why that ship is absolutely probably one of the most vital ships in the entire Federation Starfleet to exist ever. Starfleet needs ships like that. It needs to explore space. It's not an agency of war. Empires throughout history fall. Now we remember them, but look how we break up history. Napoleonic Wars, First World War, Second World War, Vietnam War, Cold War. Should I go on? Let's go further back. Punic Wars, 1, 2, and 3. We break up history via conflict and war. The Federation is a happier future that doesn't break it up by war. Starfleet breaks up its history by Golden Age of exploration, Golden Age of peace, the early stage of exploration by Starfleet in the 22nd century. But by this point we've reached a more belligerent one. It's not until Discovery helps discover, pun intended I suppose, more dilithium, fixes the political problems, gets Starfleet to remember who and what they're supposed to be, and reunites many of the member races of the Federation back under the banner of said Federation, using peace and negotiation and olive branches and root beer to try to get all these races to work together once again. And it works. And for the first time in centuries by this point, Starfleet starts to explore space again, to do the mandate that they were there to do. But even the uniforms of Starfleet have become much more militaristic by this point. We are looking at a highly militarized Starfleet that's in an almost constant state of war. They've entered survival mode and they've given up. And luckily, the agency comes out of this dark time, which we could even call the Dark Age for the Federation, and they emerge on the other side and are restored. And thanks to the pacification of their enemies, we once again see the restoration of a new, or the beginnings of, the potential beginnings of a new golden age of exploration, thanks to the new advanced technologies and other things that they have. And you can see throughout their history there's this ebbing and flowing with Starfleet, where it sways more towards militarism and sways back again. And what really Starfleet needs to be is somewhere in the middle. It does need warships, it does need combat vessels, it does need men and women who think like soldiers. But those people shouldn't be in charge. As with 32nd century Starfleet, we see what happens when those men and women are left in charge. Starfleet becomes just a military agency, no different than the KDF or any other military navy around. The Romulans, the Cardassians, whoever. And we don't need Starfleet to be that. Starfleet needs to explore. It needs to greet races with open arms and extend the hand of friendship. Yes, it may take years, sometimes decades, maybe even in some cases centuries like the Klingons to do this, but eventually you can find common ground, and with the exception perhaps of only the most belligerent of species or individuals, like even the Borg to a degree have been pacified, but only in a small number of cases where races are institutionalized and massively predisposed to violence can you not really get past it. But that doesn't mean that you stop trying. And the 32nd century Starfleet, I think, had stopped trying. But luckily, they're back on track. And as I said, you see this ebb and flow throughout history of how it just keeps changing, and how Starfleet will go from a war footing to a peace footing like that. In fact, some of the best ships in Starfleet history are the underrated ones. They're not necessarily the Constitution class or the Galaxy class. They're the Nebula class, they're the Miranda class. The ships that sit in the background and they fill in the gaps. Not going quite as back onto the far back footing as ships like the Cerritos. Maybe ships more like the Parliament class. Ships that have a tactical edge but are not strictly a warship. But they represent the backbone of what the greater Federation needs. They can switch between roles. The Nebula class, in fact, is an excellent example, because that pod on top of it can be swapped out for scientific mission profiles and militaristic mission profiles, and the overall ship itself is built basically to just do both. It's not a specialized vessel like a Galaxy class, but it's not a vessel of exploration which has some like teeth and claws, so it can fight if it has to, and it's not a Defiant class that is just teeth and claws. It's somewhere in the middle, And Starfleet, at its best, throughout history, has always been somewhere in the middle. It can deal with the Romulans, it can deal with the Borg, it can deal with the Dominion. But it doesn't have to fight them. It doesn't always need to go to war. And they sometimes find a better way. And that is probably the most human thing that humanity brought to the Federation. And note, just to sound egotistical as a human, that's what the Federation lost when Earth was no longer part of the Federation. It lost that glue that was holding the races together, because humanity's greatest strength, as Archer established when he helped found the Federation, was to get races talking and overcome their differences. By humans, they could camouflage themselves effectively with other races. They could be aggressive like a Klingon, they could be logical like a Vulcan, they could be passionate like an Andorian, they could be belligerent like a Tellarite, and they could be greedy like a Ferengi. Humans are one of the few races the Vulcans couldn't classify, and that's a good thing, because without them the Federation never would have existed. We know that basically because those races all hated each other. Without humans helping them overcome it, if the Sphere Builders got what they wanted, the Federation never would have existed. But these are all my thoughts. I know this video has gone on for quite a long time, but I think it's important to look at a civilization throughout time and see what its strengths and weaknesses are, and if we should be able to look back at the strengths and weaknesses throughout our own history to see when we were at our best, to when we were at our lowest and how we pulled ourselves out of it, to when we were at our worst and what we did to solve it. And that will ensure that the civilization we have will go on for as long as it possibly can, and we get something as great as the Federation, as peaceful as the Federation, protected but not ruled by the military. And that is the end of this video. As I said, it's rambled on for quite a while. If you liked it, please like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and let me know your thoughts on the topics we've discussed in this episode. And with that said, thank you for watching. Bye bye.